Hello and welcome. What's prompting the recent spate of violence against Christians in the Arab world, and what is the risk of a greater conflict arising? Following the targeting of Iraqi Christians, assaults have begun against Egyptian Copts, sparking fear among the religious minority in the region. As Egypt's Coptic community prepares for its Orthodox Christmas, which is just starting, it remains alert in the wake of last week's violence, which killed 21 and wounded nearly 100 at a midnight mass. It was the deadliest attack in the country's Christian minority in years. And in recent months, Iraqi Christians are experiencing unprecedented persecutions, causing thousands to flee from Baghdad to find refuge in the Kurdish north. The ever-diminishing community has been targeted by Iraq's Al-Qaeda, and since the fall of Saddam Hussein, nearly 500,000 Iraqi Christians have fled the country. So today we ask, what are the causes of the rising attacks against Christians in the Middle East, and what steps can be taken to protect them? Remember, you can join our conversation with your questions and comments. You can send an SMS or an email, and we'll also take your phone calls on the show. Joining me to discuss these issues are Iraqi Christian Ismat Karmo, the chairman of the Chaldean Assyrian Syriac Council of America. He's joining us from Detroit. In Los Angeles, Anthony Shenouda, professor of anthropology at Scripps College, whose work has focused on Coptic Orthodox Christians in Egypt. And here in the studio is Charles Sennett, the executive editor and founder of the Global Post and author of The Body and the Blood, The Middle East's Vanishing Christians and the Possibility for Peace. Gentlemen, I welcome you all to the show.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Anthony Shenouda, if I could start with you, sir, and ask, it's the start of the Coptic Orthodox Christmas. I wish you well for that. And the Al-Qaeda has threatened to target churches in Egypt. I wonder, they've actually named specific churches. How real are those threats?
Well, it's difficult to gauge how real the threats actually are. And the latest news that I have heard is that a rather rudimentary device was found in a church in Elminia, but it didn't have any detonator attached to it. Other than that, security forces have been beefed up throughout the country, and as I'm sure you know, throughout churches in Europe as well.
I wonder, Mr. Shenouda, if there is a serious effort to provide protection for worshippers. I mean, you were talking about security forces being boosted, but has it been a serious effort from your perspective?
Well, I think in the wake of what happened on the 1st of January in Alexandria, I think my sense is that the effort is serious to a degree, but of course there's quite a lot of skepticism as to what security forces might actually do in the face of a problem. I mean, this is really a matter of putting a lot of police officers around churches and not so much attempting to stem something before it actually happens.
Mm-hmm. Charles Sennett, I'd like to bring you in here, sir, and ask you, there are many criticizing the Egyptian government for not being more active in providing protection and condemning what's going on. Why hasn't there been more of an official reaction, do you think?
I think it's a fair criticism. I mean, the Mubarak government has always been dismissive of this issue. You know, this issue goes back many years, decades, at least 20 years, where the Coptic Christian minority has felt threatened, it's felt imperiled. When I was reporting on this issue in the late 90s and 2001, 2002, there were Coptic Christians in the Upper Egypt area that were very seriously threatened, and back then Mubarak was dismissing this. It's one of these issues that you have to think of in the long term. This was an explosion of violence that happened on the New Year, and it's a very serious issue right now, but it often is an issue that gets taken out of context and blown out of proportion. You have the Christian right in America, which I think is often too anxious to highlight this issue as a case in point of tension between Muslims and Christians. And then you have what I would say is a Muslim majority that is maybe a little too dismissive of the problem because they know of the pressures coming from the Christian right. But in the middle is a very serious issue, a very serious sense of intimidation, and as we see, an exodus of Christians as a result.
I'll touch on more of these issues raised in a moment. Let me bring in Ismat Karmo here, and thank you for joining us, and actually ask you to address an email we had from a viewer in Nigeria who wrote about this. Odera Goodwin in Nigeria wrote, "Governments have been fairly passive in dealing with violence against Christians. I believe that governments have a responsibility to be preemptive in containing sectarian violence rather than apologizing afterwards." And I wonder to what degree you feel perhaps that governments deliberately distance themselves from this issue.
Well, I don't think the government distanced themselves, but I think there is no serious effort done on the side of the government to protect the life of the Christian and the different places of worship. Yes, the latest events in the Church of Salvation that killed over 50 people have escalated that attention. But I think the effort is more of a reactionary effort versus something that's more proactive. At this time, I think the Christian and the minority leadership on the ground have a plan, and they have endorsed what President Talabani have proposed as a solution for the indigenous people in Iraq.
Mm-hmm.
And the government need to take action on that proposal and not just forget about it and sit aside.
Well, let me bring in Professor Shenouda again here and ask, apparently there's been a call for solidarity by some Muslim activists who say that, they would even form a human wall to protect their Christian fellow countrymen and women. And I wonder how well that call has been received among the Muslim population in Egypt.
Well, it's hard to gauge. I think a number of Muslims in Egypt are behind this. They're obviously very horrified by what happened. And I think some are quite serious about joining Christians during Christmas celebrations this evening and into early tomorrow morning as a show of solidarity. But how many people will actually do this is really hard to tell.
Mm-hmm. Charles Sennett, to what degree is Al-Qaeda targeting Christians, and Al-Qaeda has been the one that's been very active recently about that, as a way to heighten tensions with the West?
I think that's precisely what they're trying to do. And as Anthony pointed out, I mean, the vast majority of Muslims and Christians in Iraq and in Egypt get along very well. That's the vast majority. But this is a very serious Achilles heel in these two societies that Al-Qaeda is very aware of. And Al-Qaeda is very actively, I think, targeting these Christian churches as a way of knowing this will inflame tensions both in the country but also draw attention from the Christian West to this minority. And it becomes a very sophisticated and I think potentially very divisive approach by Al-Qaeda to rip a new seam through these societies. And I think it's very much incumbent upon the Muslim majority to be aware of that, to not be dismissive of this problem. And I think it's also important for the Christian community, both in the West and in Iraq and in Egypt, to keep perspective and to recognize it's a fringe that's targeting.
Let me ask you an email question, if I may, from a viewer, Amin de Lassan, who wrote in saying, hundreds of Muslims die every month at the hands of both Al-Qaeda and Western soldiers. The media's sudden focus on the increase in violence against Christians indicates a double standard. How do you answer that kind of perspective?
I've written a column on precisely that, and I agree. I think that we have to be very aware that when Al-Qaeda targets Iraq, thousands die who are both Muslim and Christian. And many more Muslims have died than Christians. That is statistically true. But let's also be aware that this is a concerted effort on the part of Al-Qaeda to find a new way to create divisions. And that's why I think it's really important for the Muslim world not to be dismissive of this very important issue. We have to not allow it to be hijacked by any cause, neither Al-Qaeda nor the Christian right in America. Keep it focused on the middle, and keep it focused on a very important test of any democracy or any government, which is how do you take care of the minority presence within your own society.
And equal treatment.
Exactly.
Yeah. We have a caller from Saudi Arabia. Bunir, thanks for being with us. What would you like to ask?
Yes, Assalamu alaikum, Riz.
Wa alaikum assalam.
The problem is that most Muslims in the Middle East are almost, you can say, against the Christians. Because when you look at the government in Egypt, a Christian is not allowed, the Christians are not allowed to establish their own churches. They have to go and say that they have to build a home in order to build a church, which is quite wrong. And the Muslims should know that the wife of the Holy Prophet Muhammad, Maria, was a Coptic. And what is happening to the Christian in Iraq, in Syria, in everywhere, the ulamas, they have to come out and say the truth. The Christians are not the enemy of the Muslims.
Okay.
No, the Jews are enemies.
Bunir, you raise an interesting point I want to actually put to Ismat Karmo. And Karmo, this is that, that there seems to be very little outcry from Muslim leaders in the region about what's been happening. And I wonder why that is the case. Couldn't they be part of the solution in trying to resolve this issue?
Well, I guess no question what you have mentioned is true. I guess the Christian in Iraq are a weak link in the whole society. And to answer the gentleman, your guest, is that I think the attention that's given to the Christian in Middle East and in Iraq is not really adequate and to the level that it should be. Simply because I feel sometimes the West distanced itself from the Christian just because they wanted to say that we are playing a fair game with everybody. And for Christian in Iraq is not part of the political fight within the Iraq. That's why we don't feel we should be targeted in this or be part of this massacre that's happening in the country. I can understand the fight between different factions within the country because they have their own political agenda within the country, but Christians don't. They always been faithful to the country. They always been serving the country. They have no political ambition in the country. They want to just live in peace.
Okay, Charles, you want
I was just going to say that I agree in large part because both in Iraq and in Egypt, Christian minorities have played such a prominent role in secular governments and secular society, and they've been contributors to both societies. They are brothers, the Christians and the Muslims in these two Arab countries. But I think at the same time, the Christian West has a far right that over-modulates this issue, and then it becomes distorted, and they talk too loudly about it. But sadly, and in agreement with you, the vast majority of Christians from the West forget that Christianity is in its origin an Eastern religion, that it comes, of course, out of the Middle East. It comes out of the West Bank and Bethlehem. And that sense of a minority that needs to persevere, to carry on, to continue to be a strong contributor to the societies is very important to communicate, and it's not heard enough.
Let me ask Professor Shenouda here. There seems to be a silence in the Arab media too about this issue, and I wonder how much harm that is doing to not just in Egypt, of course, but across the region.
Well, I agree with everything Charles has said thus far, actually, and but I think one of the problems is that the Arab media has not taken very seriously, and neither has, in the case of Egypt, the Egyptian state taken seriously the grievances that Copts make. And this isn't simply a matter of we don't have people in political power, governors, ministers, university presidents, and so on. It's also a real sense of marginality, of feeling that invisible. I mean, this is an overwhelmingly Islamic, the public sphere is overwhelmingly Islamic. And you can imagine what it's like then for a Christian to sort of move through this world. One is accustomed to it, certainly, but there's a constant reminder of one's invisibility in many ways, and I think that needs to be taken more seriously than it has.
Charles, I'll get to you in just a second. I want to ask Ismat Karmo, though, here. The Charles raised something interesting about how Christians and Muslims have lived together and served so well together, and Christians have played very much a part in maintaining a secularity in the region. I mean, even Saddam Hussein's right-hand man was Tariq Aziz, who was Christian as well. And many Christians, I gather, in Iraq say that actually they had it better under Saddam Hussein. Was that largely because they had a particularly elevated role in society, perhaps being sort of wealthy elite, largely?
Well, I can give you a numbers that tells you what's happening to the Christian. I mean, in 1980s, the Christian in Iraq were close to 2 million people, or 8% of the population. In 2003, we were 5% of the population, and today we are down to 500,000 people, or 3% almost. That's 1.5 million people have left the country between 1980 and 2010. Besides that, there is about 20,000 people migrate from Baghdad and different parts of Iraq, from the south, into Kurdistan. The question is why these people are leaving. And I think the government, whether in time of Saddam or in today's government, have not addressed properly why the Christians are leaving the country.
Yeah.
I think people, if I may, in a very short answer to that, is that I feel people, the Christian all along feel they are second-class citizens in their own country.
Okay.
Yet they are the most educated, they are very entrepreneurial in their own country, they serve their country very well, but they are always been discriminated against.
Okay.
And the government is not willing to acknowledge that.
All right, Charleston, before we get a call, well, we'll get a caller in a moment. Let's get your view.
Well, it's the sad truth of Iraq that anyone who could get out right now, while it's so war-torn, would want to get out. Many, at least, would. And so Christians are no different that way. I think the difference is they have connections to the West through the churches and through their families who live there because of this steady exodus that has happened through decades. So they have an easier chance to get out and more receptive governments in these Western countries that will take them in. So there's that factor. But I wanted to challenge the callers or even the other people on the panel here, Anthony in particular, to say, do you think there is something going on now in this story, which is that the governments are not taking the issue very seriously because they're almost afraid to, in the sense that to be seen as protecting a Christian minority is to be seen as a weak Muslim leader somehow,
and almost anti-Islamic in some
right,
ways.
and it somehow plays within the domestic politics that the growing power of the Islamic fundamentalist movements across the Middle East will challenge them politically if they're seen as defending the Christian minority. And I wonder how you perceive that, or how the callers might perceive that.
Let's get a quick response. Professor.
Yeah, I think that probably is very much a part of this reality, that the Egyptian state doesn't necessarily want to come out in defense of Christians in a significant way, precisely because it may appear weak before Muslim, the larger Muslim majority, and within the region at large. So I do agree with that. Yet the Egyptian state is constantly making calls for national unity and proclaiming that everything is fine. And this is the real problem here, is that the Egyptian state is in total denial of the real problems that are happening in Egypt.
I'd agree with that. I mean, you constantly hear Mubarak and others talk of the so-called foreign hands that are involved in this and not looking within their own country. I mean, the power is in Mubarak's hands, not foreign hands, and he's done too little to address the issue. There
are a couple more emails on that I'll get to in a second, but let's get Ramsey on the line from Michigan here in the USA. Ramsey, thanks for your patience.
Yes, I want to ask the question, as an American Christian from Middle East, where is the moral authority of the United States government? The United States government, many years ago, when there was a problem with the Muslim community in all Yugoslavia, they went aside along with the Mujahideen, who are part of the Al-Qaeda now, and fought and disintegrated the whole Yugoslavia in order to protect the Muslim and created a country to them. While President Obama, since he took over, has started trying to develop a relationship with the Muslim world, but he has paid very little attention. The United States have a moral authority of the human rights, safeguard of the religion, but literally his administration have kept quiet or backtracked. This is a genocide in making for many, many years.
Let me ask Ismet Kalmo to respond to that.
I think, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, that we feel generally that United States really don't want, in fact, how should I say it? It is like double jeopardy that we are facing here as a Christian in Iraq, that United States does not want to be viewed that they are there to protect the Christian. and that is making our life much harder, and even gaining the support of different part of the Iraqi government and even international support.
It's a good point that in a way we have political domestic pressures as well, in the sense that I think the U.S. government in Iraq and to the extent that we can exert influence through diplomacy in Egypt has a sense that they don't want to be perceived as being crusaders to protect the Christian minority in the Muslim majority Middle East, and so there's a hesitancy on the part of many American diplomats to approach this issue as well. And sadly, the Christian minority in the Middle East continues to be caught in the middle.
Right. So basically left floating because the West doesn't want to create the impression it is taking sides in that respect.
Exactly. And then you have a Muslim majority that's too dismissive, and you know it's why it's one of these issues that needs to get the extremes pushed aside and focus on the real issues at hand.
Well, caller in London, Michael's on the line. Michael, what would you like to ask?
Hi, Riz. It's just the whole question about Christians being persecuted and all this. And my biggest concern is basically, are these people that are being classified as Christians? I mean, I come from a Christian orientation, and in a lot of ways, I may not be a true Christian. But I think, questions that I ask myself is, does a Christian kill? Does a Christian disrespect? And there's so much of that going on. And basically, I just feel a little, in a sense, disturbed by the fact that, you have the United States doing whatever they do, or Britain or whatever, and it's in the name of Christianity. And to be honest, it isn't.
All right, let me put that to Professor Shenouda. The issue that something actually that Charles Sennett also raised, that the danger is this is likely to just be portrayed as a simple Muslim Christian issue rather than taking into account all the politics and other issues that go around it. What danger is there of it really just being too simplified?
Well, it's a very, very serious danger, in fact. We're talking about millions and millions of people on both sides here, Muslim and Christian. We are talking about religious communities that are not homogenous, that are not monolithic. As the caller suggested, he may come from a Christian background. Whether he's a truly pious Christian or not is another question. And the problem with the way this debate evolves and is discussed is that it tends to create these two monolithic categories. And we are, in fact, dealing with a whole variety of opinions and problems. If I may add very quickly, a number of these violent incidents that occur in Egypt often begin as disputes over things that have nothing to do with religion. For example, land disputes and that. And then the idiom in which all of this gets couched is a religious idiom. So we need to recognize that there are other problems, there are economic ones, socio-political problems that are not religious in nature but often get couched in a religious language.
Actually, just 30 seconds to go, and I'll put an email to you, Charles Sennett here. It's from Mahdi Halabi, who wrote in saying, all religious conflicts arise from ignorance of one's own religion. We need qualified professionals in religious studies and not some half-knowledge scribes. To what degree, just a quick thought, has the religious concept here been hijacked by these half-knowledge scribes?
Yeah, I think, as a representative of the half-knowledge scribe tribe, I think it's a fair point. I think there are a lot of journalists who've worked hard to understand religion as a force that we have to reckon with, just as we reckon with politics. We need, as scribes, to understand religious forces better by going back to the text, trying to be true to the mission of each faith, and not allow extremes on either end to hijack an important issue. I'm
sorry that we're so out of time. Charles Sennett, thank you very much. Anthony Shenouda and Ismet Karmo, thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you for being with us too. Starting Monday, please join us at our new time. The next Riz Khan show will be at 19:30 GMT live, followed by 3 repeats over the next day: 04:30 GMT, 08:30 GMT, and 14:30 GMT. Remember, you can also follow the program on Facebook to see what we're up to there, give us feedback on topics, and post your questions and comments. On the next show, top global risks for 2011, from the struggling global economy to managing hotspots like North Korea and Pakistan. We'll give you a forecast of what world leaders are considering in the coming year. Tune in for that. From me and the team, we'll see you next time.